of the, thank you. So everybody heard this meeting is being recorded. I was about to forget to do it. So thanks, Renate, that you pushed the recording button. Welcome everyone to the first session of the game criticism and analysis track. I am Sebastian Möhring from the University of Potsdam in Germany, and I'll be chairing this session. I'll have the pleasure to chair this session, which will consist of 2 full papers and 2 short papers. And the presentations will all be live. There will be nothing pre-recorded. There will be no artificial voices reading out the content, at least as far as I understand. And just to give you the regulations again. So for the full papers, we have between 10 to 12 minutes for the talk and 3 minutes for Q&A, or if you are a bit quicker, then you have a bit more time for Q&A, and for short papers, it's around like up to 8 minutes for the talk and 2 minutes for the Q&A. So now it's my pleasure to, wait. Oh yeah, so the first talk will be held by Anne Sullivan from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and Mel Stanfill and Anastasia Salter, who are both from the Games and Interactive Media Department at the University of Central Florida, and it's entitled "Crafting is so hardcore, masculinized making in gaming representations of labor." The floor is yours.
Mute. Okay, I'm now unmuted. Let me share my screen. And of course, now it's not working. There we go. Okay, everybody can see? We're good? Great. If you're not, sorry. Okay, well, I can skip this part because you already said who I was, but just real quick, I'm Anne Sullivan, and I did this work with my awesome colleagues, Mel Stanfill and Anastasia Salter. And this work is a critical examination of crafting systems and games, and how these systems relate to real-world crafting. To be honest, the real impetus for doing this work is our desire to understand why crafting systems and games they kind of suck, and why do they suck compared to real world crafting, which is actually a lot of fun. So after doing a bunch of work, here is the main takeaway that we found. Okay. And please go to my next slide. Thank you. So here is what we found. Fighting mechanics have more in common with real world crafting than crafting systems do. And I'm gonna let that sit for just a second. I do recognize that this is generalized. There are obviously exceptions that exist, but I wanted to see if I could prove this to you through the work that we've done. So the first thing that we did is we wanted to look at what crafters value, because looking at value systems allow us to better understand why people do things and you know, what's important to them. And the first thing that always came up was creative expression. So creative expression is this idea that you can impart your personal thoughts, feelings, ideas into what you're making or doing. And obviously crafting is full of this. Here is just a quick example of 2 quilts. It's the same design, but it was done by 2 different quilters, and they approached it very differently, and they do look quite different. And when we look at games, when you start thinking about creative expression in games, it starts having a lot in common with this idea of what is playable, where playability is this idea that the player has interesting and meaningful choices. So interesting being that not everyone will make the same choice, and meaningful means that it has some effect on the system. And so if we just take a look at World of Warcraft as an example, in this game, you can pick a class, a specialization. There's tons of options when you're actually using these abilities and fighting something. And so much to the point where these specializations become part of the personal identity or the character's identity, in which people will say, like, I'm an ice mage, or I'm this XYZ build of, you know, a paladin. But when it comes to the crafting system, while you can specialize in a specific craft, to make something, you just click a button. That's your only option. You don't really get to do anything to it. The second value that we looked at was mastery of material. And so materials are so important in crafting that the craft names themselves are often differentiated based on the material that you're using. So if somebody does sewing, they use fabric. If they crochet, they use yarn, pottery for clay, etc. And part of gaining skill in this craft is this mastery of the materials and knowing when to use them, how to get the effect you want. And, for instance, these two examples on this slide are required a lot of understanding of how the materials themselves could be worked and how they could be used. And when we look at these fighting mechanics and games, there's definitely this kind of concept there where there's definitely things that work better in different situations, and you can fight better if you understand what those are. Pokemon is a classic example in which you can have attacks that are super effective or have no effect at all based on which Pokemon you're battling. And then when we look at the crafting systems, that mastery has been abstracted away. You may unlock a new pattern or level up a crafting skill, but there's no need to understand the properties of the materials that you're using in order to make something. The other thing, the third thing, was this acceptance of mistakes. And this is this idea that mistakes are going to happen. It's part of the process. And a lot of times they're jumping off points for design changes. And there's even this feeling that, something handmade should always contain a mistake. This practice of wabi-sabi, and visible mending, where it's really about showing the work and showing the handmade nature of it and the fact that it's not perfect. And again, in fighting games, mistakes can happen and the game allows for it. You can miss, maybe you use the wrong ability, you use a Pokemon thing that's not effective. And there's room for subversion, which means that people can start using things in unexpected ways. And there's also room to learn. So some games have even gone so far as to let a player learn from the person that bested them. So like in Fortnite, when you get killed, you go into the spectating mode where you can actually follow around the person that killed you and see what they do and possibly learn from both your mistakes and their successes. But then when we go to these crafting systems, like in Stardew Valley, it's all pattern-based. So there's no room for mistakes. You either have the materials or you don't. It just doesn't accept it if there's no match. And then finally, this idea of design and process being such an important part of crafting. And when somebody is doing a craft project or making something, it's really not just about that final product. There's different processes and that will produce different looks and feels. And it's part of that creative expression of which process what process you decide to use, as well as what design you want to partake. And in fighting, again, this comes up where it's not just about killing the enemy, but there's different ways to do it. And this is what leads to this whole idea of min-maxing. There's built-in things in a lot of games where you can actually think more thoroughly and understand better how to kill things, like in Horizon Zero Dawn, where you can see the weak points of the enemy and then choose what kind of ammo you want to use that works best against those weak spots. And then once again, we return to these crafting systems, and so often it's just pick a thing you want to make, press a button, and at the most you might get a process bar, right? Like a little timer bar. Okay, that took 3 seconds real time, but that's it as far as process is concerned. So why does this matter? I mean, hopefully you're convinced that this is how it is, but this matters for a number of reasons, but I wanted to highlight two of them here. The first is that this type of thing happening in games is showing the systemic bias that we have towards labor and play, and these are being integrated into game systems, and it kind of brings attention to the idea of what else are we missing. And to just highlight how these systemic biases are coming about, crafting in particular is considered reproductive labor. Here, reproductive labor means labor that is done to support productive laborers. So for instance, cooking, raising children, etc. And these are all things that tend to be highly feminized and also devalued by society. People don't get paid much for doing these things, if at all. Whereas manufacturing, which is kind of the opposite, kind of the other end of craft, is considered productive labor. And this is generally masculinized, and it is valued by society. We do pay for things that have been manufactured. And the problem comes in is that that craft has been reduced to more closely resemble manufacturing. And this is partly because of who is making these games, but also who they're for. And the problem becomes that you remove what makes crafting crafting, and now it looks a lot more like manufacturing, where it's rapid production towards like an endpoint. It's all about the thing you make as opposed to everything else. And what happens is this evokes the game metaphor of grinding rather than self-expression and improvement over trial and error. And the second reason this matters is because it brings attention to underexplored forms of play. So my background is in AI, and so for me, I happen to know that there's not a lot of attention paid to making AI systems that could support a crafting system that is as robust and interesting as a fighting system. And also in game design, what would it look like to actually center these types of, these forms of play and make the games much more about that and less of a side, something that happens on the side. And they do obviously exist in games, but again, they're seen as supplementary. They're not core to the game. So Animal Crossing, which I know was brought up in the keynote, but also a game that is near and dear to my heart, there's plenty of ways that creativity is in this game, creative expression. You can create your own designs for both clothing and for decorating your island. There's plenty of options to decorate your own home as well as your island. With terraforming, even like you can change how your island, like where the mountains are. But all of these are secondary to the game, and none of them are really tied to the craft, the DIY system, which is their crafting system. So in conclusion, comparing the values of real life crafters with the values represented by crafting systems and games, it does highlight these systemic biases towards labor and play, and it also uncovers underexplored forms of play. Or to put it more simply, make crafting systems more like fighting systems, but without the killing. Thank you. And I will take any questions, except I can't see the chat.
Yes, thank you, Anne. I'll see the chat, so don't worry about that. Okay. If there are any questions, please step forward.
Stop sharing too.
Yes. So, but I can't currently see. Is anybody raising their hand?
Renata has a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was amazing and very informative. I would like to ask you if, in the same context, can we put emotional labor? Because it is also, I don't know if it takes it too far from your research, but I would assume no, because it's also like connected to the feminine discourse and productivity. And because I'm interested in love in games, I think it's very connected. But I would also
definitely. Oh yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, so there's definitely the emotional labor part. It is, I think it would be a different subset, but it would be really interesting to look at. I do think that like Animal Crossing is the game that I've been playing a lot of, so it's probably going to be my go-to example. There's a lot of social aspects built into that game, which starts getting at that emotional labor. You know, you can give things to your villagers, but there's also a lot of bonuses to going and visiting friends, which is really nice given where we are right now. And so there are definitely games that look at that, and it'd be super interesting to take a look more deeply. That's a cool point.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Thanks. There's some answers already in the chat that you can't see, but there's also a question.
Oh, I can
further
see the
questions.
chat now.
Okay, so you can see it. So what
Yeah.
what about the game that does it right so far?
I don't think any game does it right so far. I mean, there may be one out there and I just don't know about it, because that sure happens. But it just seems like whenever there's a crafting system, it just gets reduced, and there's nothing about the materials. There might be something about the creative expression. Like there's some games like a jewelry designer game and things like this, which are often seen as not really games or casual games or whatever. But they start getting towards that. But having that like understanding of what can be used where and what the affordances and constraints are, I don't think we've approached that. And it is something that I'm interested in, like going, my advisor is apparently here, and I'm sure he's like, okay, it's taken a decade, but she's now looped back around to her PhD work, in which it's like, oh, I could see where I could take that and start building an AI system that might start supporting the depth that would be required to do it right.
All right. In the interest, I think you sparked a lot of comments actually. So you may have to save them and
Sure.
answer them later, or go to the Discord.
I'd be happy to.
And so also what I did forget, this was the paper of our track that has been nominated for Best Paper Award. So if it seems that was a good choice.
Okay.
Yeah, go vote for this paper. Okay,
Right,
thanks
thank
a lot.
you.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. Thanks everyone for commenting. I'll have to move on to the next presentation. That is, although it's partially the same people that will be doing the next presentation, and will be presented by Mark Kretschmer and Anastasia Salter. Mark is from the Honors College from the University of Wyoming, whereas Anastasia Salter is here with a different affiliation than from the talk before. It's the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Central Florida, and talks called Party Ghosts and Queer Teen Wolves, Monster Prom and Resisting Heteronormativity in Dating Simulators. So feel free to take the stage.
Okay, well, can you hear me?
We can hear you nicely.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share a screen here. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from the Rocky Mountains. Today we are going to talk about true love. So visual novels occupy a space on the fringes of gaming. While many are sold on Steam and several have been released on gaming platforms, most visual novels are promoted to enthusiasts or fans of connected properties, primarily anime. In this examination of the queer potential of the dating simulator, we will first position the genre as traditionally governed by heteronormative and cisgender normative ideologies in its Western manifestations. We will then center a case study of a game that resists these norms on 3 levels of production, content, and mechanics. Monster Prom, a game released in 2018 and funded using a Kickstarter campaign. So the game leans into a humorous concept of monstrous romance, a playfulness that is somewhat undermined by the skinny avatars and anime aesthetics that dominate Monster Prom's visual experience. However, underneath that superficial resemblance to other dating simulators, a more meaningful queering of play exists as the game resists some of the dominant structures and conventions to alter its gameplay. Waiting for the slide to load. 1 second. Okay. So as in choose your own adventure novels, dating simulators encourage players to find the good or true endings. Bad endings, like their early print examples, require the gamer to either replay from the beginning or restart from a node that has a save file. The reward in dating simulators most frequently correspond to successful courtship. In some games, the player even receives sexual imagery to signify the successful consummation of the relationship. Some of the most famous examples include Tomeki Memorial, seen at the upper top left, Clannad, and even the popular Persona series that combines dating sim elements with dungeon crawler role-playing game design. Success in these games throughout is usually invisible to the gamer, but some dating sims like Dream Daddy have stat checks that significantly improve or inhibit success. Dream Daddy is in your top right corner there. And in the middle is the branching narrative that you've come to expect in dating simulators, as evidenced by School Days. That was a big slide. 1 second. There we go. Such dating simulators, with their presentation of relationship consummation as winning, frequently reinforce this pattern. Even games with queer representation frequently avoid questions of consent and, at the very least, enforce compulsory sexuality, or the erasure of non-sexuality by crafting a world in which characters are compelled to experience themselves as desiring subjects, take up sexual identities, and engage in sexual activity. The dating sim, as traditionally construed, occupies a liminal space between progressive and regressive representation, and many of these happy endings are clearly designed with the heterosexual male gaze in mind. The introduction of queer romances into a framework built for heteronormativity does not itself subvert that heteronormativity. Instead, it might simply enforce the same transactional mechanics and assumptions on queer relationships. Likewise, we would not use the word queering to refer to a subversion that does not recenter a queer gaze and narrative, as to do so could reinforce the heteronormativity dominant in both the field and genre. Romantic games in general challenge many typical expectations of gameplay, focusing on relationship mechanics and typically pro-social behaviors. However, the application of a market model, and by extension game concepts such as victory and difficulty, to those same relationships is inherently regressive. Can dating simulators escape this dichotomy while remaining in the game space and category? Or is the progressive representation of romance inherently at odds with the form? Pictured here is butterfly soup. So thus, this examination will build on the concept of the heterosexual imaginary, which offers us a lens to understanding the representation of dating and dating success as a reflective of the institutional reinforcement of heterosexuality. Such representation goes hand in hand with compulsory heterosexuality, which historically has been framed in feminist discourse as the institutionally entrenched reinforcement of binary and heterosexual roles that craft dominant narratives. Compulsory heterosexuality also plays a role in merely choosing certain female protagonists. For example, Ada Wong in Resident Evil 4 is seen below. So given this dominant lens, other representational systems, and particularly the extent to which players are given no choice but to be involved in heterosexual courtship, even in games where romance is decidedly secondary to the principal narrative, is less frequently challenged, and overall the compulsory heterosexuality embodied in video game play goes mostly unremarked. Sandra Lipsy's BAM suggests in 1995 that the dismantling of gender binary discourse and assumptions would require us to explode that which is currently treated in Western culture as normal and natural, for example, to turn the volume up. We argue that this type of explosion of the normal has been a long time coming in dating simulators and requires extreme and unexpected play with narrative and dating to accomplish. This type of explosion is particularly possible through science fiction and fantasy-driven representations, which have the opportunity to literally dismantle binary discourse and present alternatives. An example of that is speedrunning. So Monster Prom. As we consider contextualizing queer gaming in terms of dating sims, we introduced Monster Prom. In October 2016, Beautiful Glitch launched a Kickstarter for what at first appeared to be a familiar type of dating simulator. However, the launch campaign for the project promised something a bit different under the heading No One's Off Limits, a non-binary game, promising you can just romance anyone with anyone. At first, this sounds less like a commitment to queer representation and more like the everyone is bi trope. However, the game design reflects several notable choices that push the genre of the dating simulator forward beyond this trope. So Monster Prom includes a lot of dialogue that suggests the designer's strong awareness of the typical tropes of dating simulators, as well as higher than usual difficulty, with players likely to fail to accomplish their dating objectives. Players who try to follow traditional models of dating sims are likely to fail to win over their romantic intended. This is in part thanks to the stat dependency of gameplay. A player might choose the right answer objectively to an interaction, but lack the charm, creativity, or other dependent stat to pull that off. The modeling of player interaction recalls the approach of Telltale Games, which popularized the idea of choices with consequences by crafting conversation systems based on an illusion of memory. We've also seen such gameplay features in RPG dating sim hybrids like Persona 5 that introduce characters relatively early in the game, but prevent interactions until specific tasks or stat checks are completed. And it's also worth noting that Monster Prom does have a modding tool built into it. So Monster Prom is an often irreverent game, and some of this extremism of content has rightly drawn criticism, particularly the inclusion of one character's continual drug addiction and jokes about death by Russian roulette. Not all the representation is handled as deftly as the queer inclusivity. Monster Prom attempts to counteract criticism by starting with a personality quiz, suggesting that the player's match is determined in part by existing preferences that inform the player's stats. The self-referential humor of the game is best embodied in a character the player encounters primarily through the storyline of Zoe, the eldritch horror turned fangirl. Interacting with her will eventually lead to her sharing news about a pending publication, which draws the ire of Stanley pictured here, a Gamergate-esque character who interrupts the player's attempts to courtship. Stanley expresses his frustration with the perceived inequity of geek media given his failure to find a publisher for his Zombies on Slut Island comic. Here, Zoe also performs an important role as a potential reflection of the queer gamer. Representations of fangirls in fiction are frequently negative when they are visible at all. Zoe's portrayal as desirable, powerful, and monstrous simultaneously is a rare step forward. The game's fan base is so dedicated that the Kickstarter for the sequel launched to rapid success. Monster Prom 2 Holiday Season was launched in mid-May 2019, and before the end of the month had reached over 10 times its initial goal of 36,000 euros, with over 5,000 backers. They surpassed 100,000 euros in about 12 hours, and immediately started adding more to the stretch goals, focusing on the additions of new love interests. And here is your shop in Monster Prom. So as the designers have released more content and correspondingly offered more depth to the stories of their characters, the team has also reflected upon some of the inherent challenges of working within the form. In an update to the Kickstarter, Beautiful Glitch posted, "We very easily forget we are all people, and sometimes I worry if making a dating sim can indirectly fuel all this, since fictional characters need by definition to be simplified to fit a narrative, especially for us due to our semi-procedural structure." This conflict captures the tension that remains in the series. Despite efforts to center the monstrous queer, the mechanics of play are at odds with the homo-romantic imaginary. This challenge Ed Chang puts forth in his definition of queer gaming, which demands representation that goes beyond superficial inclusion. Monster Prom represents a step forward, if not a fulfillment of this call to action. And in closing, Representations of monstrous bodies frequently are designed to repel, as Sarah Stang's work on the monstrous feminine in video games catalogs. In the average dating simulator, beauty is normative, and the player's choices for romance or eroticism are typically distinguished through hairstyles rather than any notable difference in figure type. Todd Harper discusses this type of challenge in his work on the marginalization of fat bodies in gaming. Monster Prom pushes at the monstrous, admittedly hypersexualizing its characters, but also challenging and queering the norms and narratives of the genre. The decisions made in character representation are harmonious with the designer's larger goals, and thus offer models for how queer design can resist binaries and reshape our perception of romantic play. Monster Prom offers one model for such play, situated against a genre that at its very worst takes the desire to its basest, most transactional levels of representation. Thank you.
All right, thank you for this presentation. Are there any questions or comments by the audience? Feel free to place them in the chat or raise your virtual hand so you can ask the question. Okay, so somebody wants to know, Sarah Stang wants to know the publication date for your paper.
Our paper?
I guess. That's what I...
Which one?
Sorry, that was just the timer. Okay, that wasn't a proper question, I see.
Oh, okay.
All right. Anyone, a question? Maybe it was so thought-provocative that people are still thinking. By the way, I can also say that this paper has been was also marked as an exceptional paper, if I'm not mistaken, for this conference. So in case you are still thinking about what Mark just presented, you will be able to read it also in the paper. Okay, so no takers for any questions. I'm so sorry, Mark. I was I lost connection during your talk and I just got back in, so I didn't follow it completely, unfortunately. So I don't have any question either, which is a shame for being a chair, but thanks anyway for your talk. And we will move on, and I hope there will be questions in the Discord or on any other channel that the conference is providing. Thanks a lot. So we will move on towards the next paper, which will be a short paper. So presentation time is a bit shorter. Oh, wait, I'll go back, Mark, you're still on. So there's a question. How did you balance sharing different identities, trying on them versus not appropriating identities that are not your own? That's a question in the chat.
Within the game space? While playing the game?
In terms of your design?
Not really sure to answer that at the moment. I might have to think about that for the discourse or for the Discord page. But one thing I did was, at least to start off, when I made my character, I went with genders that I don't normally identify with, just to see how that would influence the level of play in the game for me. And then after that, I went back and played as a cisgender male to see. And actually, if it helps, I preferred to play as genders that were not my own when looking at and observing these sort of identical structures.
Okay, that was a quick and brief answer. So maybe there will be more to talk about in the Discord. thanks a lot for asking the question, and thanks for answering it. Thanks for your talk. And we will move on to the next presenter. Otherwise, I'll get into trouble for not keeping time. And the next talk will be presented by Jose Macias from the Federal University of Maranhão in Brazil. And his talk's called Emergent Precariousness, Video Game Modding in the Context of Decolonial Philosophy of Technology. Jose, the floor or the stage is yours.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hope there's no problem because I'm using a tablet because I don't have like a good camera, and I'm also watching on my PC my own presentation. So I hope there's no noise or no. I'm logged twice on Zoom. I don't know if there's a problem. But as Sebastian introduced me, I'm from Brazil. Yeah, I live in the state of Maranhão. This is where I teach. Let me just try to put my presentation while I talk so I could use the time better. Let me see here. Yes, so as I was saying, I'm from the state of Maranhão in Brazil. Is kind of what we call the eastern border of the Amazon region. It's not really like the Amazon, like the core of the Amazon, but it is in the vicinity. I recently arrived here from Rio, but I did all my education back in Rio. But I'm a teacher here, so that's where I come from. The thing is, sorry, I'm just using first time. Yeah, so my presentation is about the idea of emergent precariousness. Is a kind of a toolkit that I'm trying to use to explain what is Brazilian modding to me in the context of the critique of modernity and post-colonial and decolonial frameworks. I use both interchangeably, although I know they're not the same thing. But for instance, the authors I use. Sorry, I know I'm not appearing. I'm having a hard time finding the thing that I want to share here. Yeah. Wait. My PowerPoint thing that doesn't appear to me as an option for sharing. Oh well, that's no problem. Let me see if I can share something here. That's why I have the other screen. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can share the other screen. If you can see, that would be like fantastic. I use this on my class, so that's why I use two computers. I'm logged on two computers because I can share one and use the presentation on another. I know you'll see me like sideways because I'm looking at the computer. And yes, this is me. Yeah, I managed to do it.
All right,
so
you
I don't know if
6 minutes.
Yeah, I know. I'll be really brief, just so I can explain. So my paper is about this general critique of modernity in terms of this post-colonial and the colonial frameworks. So I'm working mostly with the idea of piracy and shifting the meaning of piracy towards like this, what I believe with the authors that I use, like there are like a general marginalization and criminalization of piracy in terms of the discussion that are set in the Lawrence Lessig book, Free Culture. Maybe some of you know of it. And when he addressed the topic of Asian piracy, and I used some of the authors like Kavita Philip and Lawrence Liang. They are advocates for piracy, and as they understand, it's the way of experiencing modernity on from a global South perspective. That's what. So that's my main points in the paper. And what I try to say, what I try to address is when we talk about this global South dynamics, the North and South dynamics, and the way the very concept that we use, they are created in a they are meant to be used and meant to be used in a global North perspective. When we shift the meaning of something like piracy, we change the meaning, and we create a whole new dynamics to work with the world, like video games or other aspects of digital technology as a whole. That's why I'm aiming here. In the papers I explain better. So I work with two modding groups. So in case of Pro Evolution Soccer, they are called brazucas. It's kind of like Brazilian, like in a slang way. I brought this here because this is another version of the same game in the same modding group. And as you can see, they don't just pirate in the sense that they, like the common sense that they share materials, but they also change, they customize them, and that for me is the important part, because in the sense that when they customize the content, they bring this Brazilian kind of way of experiencing gaming. That's which is very important to me. So again, I will skip to the next one. This one here, for instance, there's something that the players usually do. They insert like propaganda, like for instance, this is the Global Network is a major network here in Brazil. And if you think about it, football games, they usually simulate like a broadcast, a TV broadcast of the game. So the players, they find it funny and amusing maybe to put like the actual propaganda for a game, something that would be not allowed in a commercial game, of course, because of licensing and stuff like that. Other thing that's important in my paper is the way they grade the players. For instance, I don't know if many of you play this football games, but each player has his like own overall rating, and they kind of tweak them a little bit, like for their own pleasure, like, oh, I like Messi better than I like Cristiano Ronaldo, so I make Messi better than Cristiano Ronaldo. But also because of identity issues. So for instance, a Brazilian player like Neymar, they would up their overall ratings, for instance. And I try to talk about how they organize themselves through social networks and so websites, and their connection with the original game. Because at the same time, I call this piracy, but while I interview most of them, these modders, they don't consider piracy. For them, is a way to actually honor the game. So in terms of discourse, they don't consider themselves pirates, which for me is very important. Let me just skip to the next one. It's loading. In terms of the other game that I talk about, that is World of Warcraft, I'm talking about private servers that some of you may know, but the different thing is that they actually still running in Brazil, which I find is interesting and amusing, and they're still running on the, I think, second expansion, like Wrath of the Lich King. I don't know if some of you know them. And for these players, it's important to keep the game, in the same conditions that it were back in, I believe, 2007, right, where Wrath of the Lich King was released. And for them, again, they see some kind of homage, but also criticism of the way the industry develops. That's actually one of my main points. If you talk about like the macro aspect of the paper, is again a kind of conflict between the macro industrial aspect of games and of all this micro customizations as a way of criticism of the whole industry, and of course the adaptation to the Brazilian market.
I'm afraid your time is up. Maybe that's a good point in your talk where we can where
Yes.
where the audience has grasped some kind of idea what your paper is about. And maybe there are some questions from the audience.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also for your talk,
Let
of
me
course.
take it out. Okay, yes, let me stop sharing. Thank you. Sorry for that.
No, don't worry.
Oh, sorry. Did I share it again?
I think it's fine.
Yeah.
So what do you, okay, so there's a question from Colin. Do you find these folks are surprised that someone would think of them as pirates?
Yes, because for them, wait, if I find it.
Do you
Yeah,
think?
no, they are surprised. Yeah, because I'm thinking if they are surprised of, yeah, I am surprised. Yeah, they are surprised. Yeah, they usually surprised because for them, they're not pirating the game. Sometimes they usually actually buy their own copy, but they pirate like Photoshop. They pirate everything else around it. So for them, they are not pirating the game, and they're actually again this making some kind of homage or actually making the game sell better in the country because they are kind of doing some kind of advertising of the game. And they don't use this word, of course, these are my words, but this I believe I interpreted it this way, how they see it.
All right. Is there one more very brief, quick question? All right. Well then, thanks a lot for your talk. And I'll have to, again, we'll have to refer everyone to the paper that will be available for you guys to read. Thanks, Colin, for the question. And that said, we will move on to the next and the final talk of this session. And Colin basically introduced himself already by asking the question. And he is from Georgia Tech, as well as his co-author Michael Nietzsche, and their talk is entitled "Primal Clay: World Building with a New Materialism."
Thank you, Sebastian. Could I get a quick confirmation that you can see the opening slide?
I can see the opening slide, and I can hear and see you clearly.
Tremendous. Then let's dive in. Hello, all. This is a presentation of the late-breaking paper, Primal Clay: World Building with the New Materialism. My name is Colin Strickland. This paper was co-authored by Professor Michael Nietzsche of the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'll start out by introducing the artifact. That's a world creation game called Primal Clay. I provide a short look into the underlying theory, the design process, and finish up with our preliminary findings that explain why it's a good idea to collaborate with a thing. This project began with a question. How can the recent turn to new materialism and to non-human agency inform game design research? Our process followed a method of research through design, culminating in the creation of our prototype. In Primal Clay, human players collaborate with the concrete product Hydrostone and an interactive narrative built in Twine to produce a fictional game world. This work shows one way that material can exert thing power within the context of a collaborative, co-creative game. Primal Clay falls into the category of world-building games in general. Creating artificial worlds is, of course, a central part of game design. It's also part of the core gameplay in titles like From Dust, Black and White 2, and Dwarf Fortress. These games carry with them a certain mindset, though. Just look at the aptly named God's Eye View camera orientation. It foregrounds players' ability to shape and control the world. You look down at the world, which is your oyster, your commodity, yours to control. Here, the player might think of themselves as an almighty creator god, a demiurge. When human creators think of themselves as wielding absolute power, they are stuck in this demiurge mindset, blinded to the influence of non-human actors. This attitude excludes all other non-human creative partners. It narrows the design space. And yet, it's the dominating perspective in current setting creation games. By contrast, Primal Clay seeks to reconfigure player relationships with materiality, to invite this supposedly inert object to create with. By foregrounding the power of things to act, our game experimentally seeks to show how materiality can enhance the creative process and potentially broaden the field of game design. For us, the challenge lay in designing a forum that could enable the material to speak. So then, let's talk about the thing itself. Here's how gameplay works. First, wet hydrostone is poured onto a play surface where it slowly hardens. The human players represent creator gods who manipulate but never totally control the hydrostone, while the hydrostone represents the primal clay that becomes the setting. Once the hydrostone has dried, its shape becomes a rough map of the fictional world. In Primal Clay, human players take turns answering one of the prompts proposed by the game's Twine component. After the human player performs their action, a line is added to the Annals, an ongoing chronicle of the game that's appended to the bottom of each successive Twine prompt. The Twine narrative positions the players. The hydrostone and its human partners collaborate in the gradual shaping of the material component, while the hydrostone's drying time enforces a time limitation and defines material agency beyond the human player's control. The Annals keep a digital record of players' decisions, while the factually forming world provides a material, cultural object with a history in itself. So, why is any of this interesting? Why are we talking about it at FDG? Well, this project builds on 3 key points in the critical study of materiality: experiences of materials, material culture, and material agency. So, Karana and Khamir's framework for material experiences served as an instrument for early development. This heuristic asks participants to handle, think about, and describe materials, yielding insight into their human experiences. But importantly, it is a heuristic which strives to acknowledge the active role of materials in shaping our ways of doing. It's not only the individual player's experience that defines a world-building activity, though, but also the resulting object as a defined thing in itself and as part of a material culture. For Glassy, artifacts incarnate the decisions that went into making them. World-building games have the potential to generate those meanings, distilling them into a tangible artifact. Finally, from a new materialist perspective, Barat's co-constitutive intra-actions provide an engine for gameplay. We do not act upon our objects of play, but we act with. There are no gods here, only relations. The material selection part of design and development was relatively easy. Cement is a category of material that clearly and obviously acts. Hydrostone is a powdery white substance when dry. When mixed properly with water, it dries extremely hard, making hydrostone useful in solid cast architecture, art, statuary products. It is, in other words, a building material. With the material chosen, the next design phase applied Karana and Khamir's toolkit, which we mentioned a little bit ago, in a material workshop. But for me, of the most interest was the toolkit's sensorial level exercise. Users were asked to rate binary properties like smooth or rough, tough or ductile, on a scale. But in our case, participants refused to commit to simple numerical answers. They wanted to tell the story of their experiences and actually penciled in explanatory notes to accompany the numbers. This finding led to the model of traditional RPGs, storytelling games, which led in turn to the development of a Twine-based interactive narrative that positions and coordinates players with the aid of simple prompts. So, the key concepts. In Primal Clay, material culture is reflected through the physical lump of hydrostone that's left at the end of play. It signifies the fictional world created by players over the course of the game, but it's vital to understand that the term players includes more than the game's human participants. Human players' material experience remains important, but Primal Clay introduces hydrostone as an active player through its own material agency. The main question during initial playtesting was whether the design would support novel material interactions. Would the material speak through play? There are a few moments that stand out. The bone desert and island fish pictured here were results only possible with hydrostone. One combines multiple pieces, the other relies on the way the material can be shaped before drying up. In its own way, the texture, break patterns, viscosity, and other physical attributes of hydrostone shape the game world. Now on this one, notice the flower petals that are pictured. They arrive thanks to the game's meteor prompt. This reads, each player takes it in turn to drop a heavy object onto the world. In an early playtest, participants used a flower vase as their meteor. It didn't do much damage, but the flowers lost petals that stuck to the world's central mountain. These petals became enormous flowering vines in the setting and were summarily incorporated into the fiction and the game's annals. Each emergent form becomes part of the world's story as it's co-constituted by the player, the interactive narrative, and the Hydrostone, as well as other materials, leading to an interacted world creation. It is not necessarily easy or comfortable to let material speak. It does so in a different time frame than humans, and in a different kind of voice. By tying both material and human actors into a familiar format, the cultural artifact of a game, it becomes possible to create a common ground for interaction. In effect, the magic circle connects humans and non-humans. This approach connects to the work of Acharya and Wardrop Fruin presented at this conference last year. We engaged their framework for world creation games more fully in the paper, but here I'd like to highlight Hydrostone's moderator duties. In short, Hydrostone acts as the game's de facto timekeeper. By drawing, it directly shapes the experience of play, forcing human players to listen to the voice of the material. So to review, Primal Clay is a co-creative world-building RPG in which material, Hydrostone, actively participates as a player. Its physical properties serve to inspire specific imaginings in human players, and its drawing time serves a moderator function. The material acts. In that way, Primal Clay serves as a game-based experiment for new materialist interaction. It aims to connect human players to non-human activity through material experience and records those impressions through the tangible artifact of material culture. Primal Clay argues for a broader understanding of collaborative practices of gameplay and game design. Primal Clay shows that new ontologies may lie within the objects that surround the gaming table. These are worth exploring for humans and non-humans alike and open up new challenges and design opportunities for world-building games, but also, potentially, for other genres. So, thank you for your time. I would now be happy to take any questions.
Thanks for your talk. I was about to remind you to stay on time, but you just stayed on time. Are there any questions for Colin? Is there anybody raising a virtual hand? Isaac Cart, you can ask a question and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm like, it's interesting engaging with this when I've been like so far into the virtual like tabletop collaborative space over the past few months. But so my question is, you talked about like the players engaging with the materiality. Were there things that this design allowed because of the materiality, other than the stuff that you've covered so far?
Of the stuff that I've covered so far.
I mean,
other than the specific, the two ways that I think about it, about how the materiality affected the fiction, are the properties of the material, and the general change that presenting the material in this way brings over players. They begin to incorporate other pieces. They begin to think about the non-human actors that go into gameplay, and they let them affect their fiction. So I suspect that your question is hedging towards, well, couldn't you just do this in a digital game? Why do we have a material component?
Sorry, I don't think you can continue. You have to continue this conversation on Discord.
I have responses, but I'll continue on the Discord.
Yeah, maybe you continue on Discord. I just have to ask, Anne Sullivan, was this just a waving goodbye, or were you wanting to ask a question in the chat? All right. So it seems that was a waving goodbye, I assume. And I think with this, I have to conclude this session. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for the enlightening talks. You can see my image. I'm already zoomed out. That always means time's up. And yeah, looking forward to talking to you during the conference. And please go to Discord, speak to the speakers, and read the papers, and continue to be a great audience and great speakers. Thanks a lot.